Marcus Ostrander was 19 years old the first time he waded into the shallows below the old mill dam and came up with a log so waterlogged it took both arms and most of his strength just to roll it onto the bank. It was March of 2009, on a stretch of the Little Sabine River outside Colton, Kentucky, and the log had probably gone into the water sometime before Marcus's own grandfather was born. He didn't know that yet. He only knew it was heavier than anything had a right to be, black with a century of tannin, and that there were more of them, dozens more, maybe hundreds, sitting on the river bottom under 8 feet of slow brown water where they'd settled after the old mill's log drives had scattered them there before anyone alive could remember exactly when. A man fishing off the county bridge that afternoon watched Marcus drag the log up the bank, prop it against a fence post, and stand there catching his breath, and asked him, not unkindly, what in the world he thought he was doing. Marcus told him he was pulling logs out of the river. The man asked why. Marcus said he was going to fix the mill. The man laughed, the way people laugh at something so far outside what they expect to hear that their first response is just to assume it's a joke, and told Marcus that mill hadn't turned a wheel since his own grandfather was a boy, and that a river full of waterlogged timber wasn't going to change that. By that evening, the story had already made it into town, the way stories do in a place the size of Colton, and by the following week it had traveled from the feed store to the diner to the pews at First Baptist, growing a little stranger and a little more foolish at every stop, until the version making the rounds had Marcus Ostrander diving the river bottom by lantern light, convinced there was buried treasure in a 100-year-old mill race. None of that was true. Marcus was just pulling logs, one at a time, whenever he had a free afternoon, and setting them out to dry on the bank behind his family's place. Let me tell you about Marcus Ostrander, because what he did over the next several years only makes sense if you understand where that patience came from. Marcus's grandfather, a quiet man named Emory Ostrander, had run a small sawmill operation on that same stretch of family land for close to 40 years before arthritis took his hands and he sold off the equipment to a bigger outfit 2 counties over. Emory had a saying he used often enough that Marcus could recite it before he understood what it meant: a thing left in the water long enough either rots or it cures, and the only way to know which one you've got is to pull it out and look. Emory had said it about wood, about land, about people, and Marcus had grown up hearing it apply to almost everything that came across his grandfather's path. Marcus had spent a fair amount of his teenage years in his grandfather's shop rather than out with kids his own age, not because he was pushed there but because he liked the quiet of it, the way a piece of rough lumber slowly became something useful under patient, repeated attention. Emory had never pushed him toward the sawmill trade specifically. What he'd passed on instead was something closer to a way of looking at things, a habit of assuming that most of what got thrown away or left behind had simply been abandoned by people who ran out of patience before the value showed itself. Marcus didn't set out, at 19, to rebuild a mill. He set out to see what was actually sitting on that river bottom, because his grandfather's voice in his head told him that 100 years underwater didn't automatically mean ruined, and he wanted to know for certain rather than assume. The old grist mill itself sat a quarter-mile upstream from the Ostrander place, a stone and timber structure built sometime before the Civil War, according to the county historical marker nobody read anymore, with a wheel that had gone still sometime in the early 1900s when a spring flood had torn out the mill race and nobody in the family that owned it at the time had the money or the will to rebuild it properly. The logs on the river bottom below the old dam were the last uncut inventory from that era, timber that had been floated down from upriver stands and never made it to the saw before the mill shut down, sinking instead into the cold water where the tannin and the low oxygen had kept them from rotting the way they would have on dry ground. Marcus had known about them his whole childhood, the way you know about something that's always just been part of the landscape, dark shapes under the water that the older men in town called snags and warned you to watch out for if you were fishing. He was 20 when he pulled his first real proof out of that river, a log he'd hauled up in the spring of 2010 that turned out, once it dried and he cut a test section with his grandfather's old crosscut saw, to be sound clear through, dense and dark and strong in a way that modern lumber simply wasn't anymore, because trees don't grow that way when they're cut on a 40-year rotation instead of left alone for 150. He drove that piece over to a man who bought reclaimed lumber for flooring and furniture work in the next county, more out of curiosity than expectation, and the man offered him $11 a board foot for anything else like it, more than 4 times what green lumber from a commercial mill would have brought. Marcus didn't quit his day job at the feed store. He didn't rush out and buy equipment he couldn't afford. What he did instead was keep pulling logs, 1 or 2 a week when the weather allowed, letting each one air dry under a lean-to he built along the fence line, and keeping a plain composition notebook where he wrote down every log's length, its condition, and whatever he could tell about the wood once it opened up. By the end of that first full year, he had 43 logs drying on the bank and a notebook with 43 entries in it, most of them still guesses, because green-cut reclaimed river timber doesn't tell you what it really is until it's had a year or two to dry. The town's opinion of what Marcus was doing didn't improve much over that stretch. Colton had lost most of what industry it once had by the time Marcus was pulling his first logs, the mill long gone, the small furniture shop that used to buy local hardwood closed since the late 1990s, and a general sense among the older men who gathered at the co-op counter each morning that anything worth doing in that town had already been tried and had already failed. A man named Curtis Pemberton, who'd run the feed store where Marcus worked for going on 30 years and who considered himself, not unfairly, the closest thing the town had to a working historian of what did and didn't succeed there, told Marcus flatly one morning that he was wasting good years on a river full of driftwood, and that the mill had been dead longer than Marcus had been alive for a reason. Marcus didn't argue with him. He went back to stacking feed sacks and kept pulling logs on his days off. What Curtis Pemberton and the rest of the co-op counter didn't know, because Marcus hadn't told anybody yet, was that he wasn't just planning to sell reclaimed lumber. He was planning to rebuild the mill race, repair the wheel, and get the old grist mill turning again, not as a museum piece but as a working operation, grinding cornmeal and flour the way it had 150 years earlier, using the recovered timber to fund the restoration and eventually to build out a small retail operation selling the reclaimed lumber itself to people who wanted wood with that kind of history in it. The years between 2010 and 2015 were the quiet middle of this story, the part that doesn't make for exciting telling but is the part that actually built everything. Marcus kept working the feed store during the week and the river on weekends, pulling somewhere between 200 and 300 logs a year depending on water levels and how much daylight he had after his shift. He learned the river's moods the way his grandfather had learned the mill's moods, which stretches of the bottom held the densest concentration of timber, which logs came up sound and which came up so waterlogged and punky they were only fit for firewood, how to read the color of the water after a hard rain to know whether it was safe to wait or better to wait a day. He ruined his shoulder pulling one particularly stubborn log free from where it had wedged under a submerged root ball, and spent 3 weeks that summer working one-handed, which taught him more about picking his battles with individual logs than any of the successful pulls had. He sold the driest, most usable timber as fast as he could season it, plowing almost every dollar back into the mill itself, a new mill race dug and lined by a contractor he paid in installments, a rebuilt well hub fabricated at a machine shop in the county seat, sluice gates salvaged from a decommissioned dam upstream and refitted to the smaller scale of the Ostrander mill. Some seasons the money moved faster than the work, and he'd have cash sitting from a good lumber sale waiting on a contractor's schedule. Other seasons it was the reverse, the race half dug and the money not yet there to finish it, and Marcus would go back to pulling logs harder that month to close the gap. His notebook, the same plain composition style his grandfather had used for his sawmill records, grew into a second volume by 2013 and a third by 2015, tracking not just the logs but every dollar spent and every dollar earned, the way Emery Ostrander had taught him a man ought to track anything he intended to trust. The county itself wasn't doing well during those years either, which mattered more to this story than it might seem to at first. Colton, like a lot of small towns in that part of Kentucky, had watched its population shrink through the 2000s as coal work dried up and young people left for cities that had something more to offer than a feed store and a diner. The tax base thinned. The county couldn't fund much beyond the essentials, and a fair number of the older buildings downtown sat empty, including the building that had once housed the furniture shop that used to buy local hardwood before it closed. It was the kind of slow decline that didn't announce itself with any single dramatic event, just a town getting quieter year over year, which made an unemployed 19-year-old spending his weekends hauling driftwood out of a river seem, to most people watching, like exactly the kind of thing a dying town produces rather than something that might do anything about it. Marcus pulled his 3,000th log out of the river bottom in late February of 2016, 6 years almost to the week after the first one, and by then the mill race was finished, the wheel was rebuilt and hung, and the only thing standing between Marcus and a working mill was a final inspection from the county to confirm the structure was sound enough to reopen to the public. He'd spent the better part of that final winter finishing the millhouse floor with boards cut from the earliest logs he'd pulled, the ones that had been drying longest and proven soundest, so that the building itself would be made, floor to rafters, out of timber that had spent a century at the bottom of the river it now stood beside. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't put up a sign. He simply told the county inspector, a woman named Denise Halloway who'd known the Ostrander family for years and had watched the whole project unfold from a polite distance, that he'd be opening the gate that Saturday in April, and if anybody wanted to see whether a 100-year dead mill could turn again, they were welcome to come stand on the bank and watch. More people showed up than Marcus expected. Word had traveled the way it always did in Colton, but this time it wasn't the exaggerated version about buried treasure or lantern-lit river dives. It was people who'd watched Curtis Pemberton's feed store employee haul driftwood out of the river for 6 straight years and wanted, finally, to see what it had actually amounted to. Curtis Pemberton himself came, standing near the back of the small crowd gathered on the bank, arms crossed, the same posture he'd held at his own counter the morning he told Marcus he was wasting his years. Marcus opened the sluice gate a little after 10 that morning. The water came through slow at first, the way water does when it's finding a channel it hasn't run through in 100 years, and for a moment nothing happened at all, just the sound of water moving where it hadn't moved in a lifetime. Then the wheel shuddered, caught, and began to turn, groaning on its rebuilt hub, throwing a fine spray off its paddles in the April sun, and inside the millhouse the old grinding stones, reset and trued by a millwright Marcus had found 2 counties over, began to turn with it. Nobody said much for a while. Denise Holloway, standing near her truck with a clipboard she'd mostly stopped looking at, would say later that it was the quietest she'd ever heard that riverbank, quieter than she'd have expected from a crowd that size, everybody just watching a wheel that hadn't moved in 100 years find its rhythm again. Curtis Pemberton found Marcus afterward, once the crowd had mostly thinned, standing near the millhouse door with cornmeal dust still settling on the floor behind him from the first test grind. Curtis didn't say much. He looked at the wheel a while longer, still turning, and then he looked at Marcus and said that he supposed he'd been wrong about the river being just driftwood. Marcus said he supposed everybody was wrong about something they hadn't looked at closely enough yet. Curtis didn't argue with that either. The mill has run every spring and fall since, grinding cornmeal that Marcus sells out of the same millhouse alongside the last of the reclaimed lumber from those early years, most of it gone now into flooring and furniture in 3 states, with a waiting list of buyers who specifically ask for river-cured timber whenever a new batch comes up dry enough to cut. Denise Holloway still stops by most autumns to check the structure, though it's more habit than duty by now, and she'll tell anyone who asks that she's inspected a lot of buildings in that county over the years and never once watched a crowd go that quiet over one turning wheel. Marcus still keeps a notebook, the 4th one now, sitting on a shelf built from wood pulled out of the water the same year the mill first turned again. Amory Ostrander didn't live to see the wheel turn. He died in the winter of 2014, 2 years before Marcus finished the race, but Marcus kept a photograph of him in the millhouse anyway, taken decades earlier standing beside the wheel back when it still ran, the same wheel Marcus spent 6 years and 3,000 logs bringing back to the exact same motion. If you'd stood on that riverbank in the spring of 2009 and watched a 19-year-old drag a black, waterlogged log up onto the bank, you'd have had every reasonable cause to laugh, the same as the man on the bridge did that first afternoon. Nobody in Colton knew why he kept going back to that river, year after year, when everyone could see plainly that the mill had been dead longer than he'd been alive. But the wheel turned again that April, and it's turned every season since, and the river bottom under the old dam runs a good deal shallower now than it did the day Marcus Ostrander waded in the first time, not because the water dropped, but because he pulled out everything the river had been keeping since before anyone in that town was born. What's sitting at the bottom of the thing you've already decided is worthless?